Let's talk today about building a network of spiritual influence for your child. Now, you may recall that last week we looked at worship issues and children's ministry, and we're making some progress through the life stages of your child. And now we're moving into those teen and adolescent years, but there's some bleed over between these subjects. But looking forward to discussing with you how we can build that network that helps to keep your child connected, not only in their teen years, but especially as they transition into their college years and then even beyond. Now, I want to say this. It's so important that as a parent that you maneuver godly people into your child's life. Now, notice why I say a couple things there. Godly people, and that you maneuver them into your child's life. And I want to tell you why. It's because you need somebody who will tell them what you would tell them if they would listen to you. And if you've raised teenagers, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes when they're 14 and 15, they're not listening to you like they were when they were 8 and they were 9. So with my daughters, I wanted other people speaking into their lives and singing the same tune that I was singing when they would not listen to me. So how can we build that network so that people are speaking into the life of your teenager and it's beginning again to affect their faith to the point that they're getting more and more committed and they're attending church not only as a teenager, but then as 35 and 45 and 55-year-olds, they're still strong in their faith. So as we talk about maneuvering godly people into your child's life, who are these people? Well, it's your volunteers who work with students at your church, staff members, it could be Bible study leaders, it could be pastors, youth pastors, staff members, it could be coaches who are godly. It could be even neighbors who are fellow church members. It could be teachers. So the point is, who are those influences for your child other than mom and dad or mom or dad? It's important we have a handle on that and that we're proactive as parents about surrounding them with people who can, again, tell them what we're telling them about growing in their faith. Well, today's text is in Matthew chapter 19, verses 13 and 14. I love this text. And it's something that happened in the life of Jesus, which is very telling for one of the key points we learned from our research. It goes like this. Then children were brought to Jesus, so he might put his hands on them and pray. Wow, what an opportunity these children had and these parents. Can you imagine? But notice what happened. But the disciples rebuked them. Then Jesus said, "Leave the children alone. And don't try to keep them from coming to me, because the kingdom of heaven is made up of people like this." Now, notice some things about this text. First of all, did you notice that the disciples rebuked the children for which Jesus rebuked the disciples? He didn't have anything to do with that. He wanted the children to come and to gather around him and to lay his hands on them. And this is typical for Jesus. You see this throughout the scriptures. You see a lot of examples of the way he interacts and relates to children. An example, in Matthew 18:10, it says this. Jesus said, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones, one of these children, for I say to you that their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven." And there's that text where we get that implication that there's a guardian angel, there's someone watching over. It's more than an implication. I believe it is a biblical teaching that, God cares for children. Christ cared for children. We see that come out in that thought there. In chapter 18, verses 2 through 5, it says that Jesus called a child to himself and set him before the crowd and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So Jesus held children in high esteem and with respect. When performing the miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, who did he call upon? It was a lad who brought the loaves and the fishes. It was a little boy. You see Jesus bringing a child to life from the dead. When I was growing up, we sang of his love. We sang that song, and I'll bless you by not singing it, but just telling you the words. Jesus loves the little children. All the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. And then in Matthew 18:6, it says, "But whoever causes the downfall of one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for him if a heavy millstone were hung around his neck and he would drown in the depths of the sea. Do you get a sense of how important Jesus thought children were to us and to him and to the world? And he just embraced and loved children and loved boys and girls. And I think it tells us something that we need to hear not only as parents but also as church leaders, and it's this: we are supposed to love children personally. Not just your children, but children in general. And as a church, we're to love children, seeking to guide them not only to personal faith in Jesus, but also to grow as a disciple who serves God for all of their lives. You may recall earlier in our session we did some weeks ago, we read from Psalm 78, where it talked about sharing our story not with our children, it said with their children. I just pray and hope that if you're watching this right now, you're a part of this Bible study, that not only do you have a concern for the children who are in your home and your family, but all the children not only in your church, but those in your community, because Jesus modeled that. When we think of children, we're not just thinking of 6 and 7-year-olds, but also those 14, 15, and 16-year-olds. And I want to share with you some things we learned as we continued our national research from young adults who grew up attending church and stayed. Here's the first thing I want you to understand. While the research showed no correlation between having a vocational student pastor or not, now I've got to stop right there. Being a former student pastor, that hurts my feelings. When we began to look at those who grew up in church and whether they were still there, did you hear that? There was no correlation between whether one was still in church as an adult and whether they had a youth pastor or a student pastor or not. It's not necessarily bad news. If you'll hang on, I'll tell you how to interpret that and how it can actually encourage you. However, we did find this. If a student pastor was present, likability made a difference. Likability. If they had a student pastor, they were 16% more likely to have stayed if they liked him or her. So that relationship between a student, a teenager, and a student pastor is important if they have a student pastor, but we found it wasn't critical that they had a student pastor growing up. But you've got to hear this also. If your church is medium or larger size and you have the prerogative and the ability and the resources to bring on a vocational, whether part-time or full-time student pastor. Second thing we saw was this. The research showed that having multiple student pastors during teen years was more detrimental than having none at all. Now, I'm not saying if you're in a larger church and you're blessed to have 2 or 3 student pastors, that's not what I mean by multiple student pastors. I mean a teenager growing up with a youth pastor in the 7th and 8th grade, then another one in the 9th grade, then another one in the 10th grade, another one in the 11th and 12th grade. In other words, through those 6 or 17 years, they go through a series of different student leaders. We found that it was healthier and they were more likely to still be in church if they'd experienced 1, maybe 2, and nobody can stay one place forever, especially in a vocational sense. So having 2 didn't matter, but having multiple student pastors was worse than not having one. And that says some things. If you have vocational student pastors in your church, you need to bring in those who will stay long term, and you need to treat them well. And when they make mistakes, and trust me, they will, you don't need to run them off. You need to do your best to coach them up. That's actually healthier for your teenager. Here's the next thing that was very interesting about the teen experience. The research revealed a small correlation. Now, this was not one of the major issues. Remember, there were 15 huge issues, and there were 10 smaller ones. This is one of the smaller ones, but it did warrant some conversation because it was larger than the margin of error. It revealed that a small correlation between attended Christian camps as a teenager and the probability of staying in church as adults. Look at it this way. We surveyed those who grew up in church and are still there. The ones that are still there were more likely to have attended church camps, and the ones who had dropped out were more likely not to have attended Christian camps as a teenager. Not only that, we saw that the more Christian camps they attended, the better it was. And that was very interesting. We did not find the same thing when we were talking about children. A little bit different finding there. It was not significant, didn't even really give a blip on the radar. But when it came to the teen experience, we saw that Christian counts were important. And we'll give some interpretation of that when we talk about what parents need to do with this information. But let's continue on with what the research revealed. Also, the research revealed that student ministry issues, while it came up only once as one of the 15 biggest issues, student ministry came up once. And the issue there was if they liked their student pastor or not. But when looking at all the subjects in clusters, in other words, you take all 15 issues plus those 10 issues and you begin to match and see how they relate to one another. When we begin to study these in clusters, and if you happen to have notes, there's a chart there, or you can find it in the book. But what happened there, when looking at all subjects in these clusters, student ministry experience was the second greatest factor influencing whether one stayed or strayed. Now, what was the number one thing? It had to do with family dynamics and the spirituality of parents. But when looking at it in a multi-layered approach, while it was only, again, one issue of the 15, it was the second greatest influence. So what your church does with students is important. And that's why you need to be engaged as a parent. Even if your child's in preschool or elementary school, you want to have all the ducks in a row before they ever get into that area of life. Here's the next thing. A young adult who grew up in church, we found, was 90% more likely to have strayed if they did not like their pastor when they were growing up. Now, by the way, I've never seen that anywhere. That was really unique to our research, and it's intriguing, and it really makes sense when you begin to put two and two together, and we will give some explanation for that. So now we're shifting, though, from the student ministry dynamics and getting to an issue that has to do with your child no matter what their age is, elementary school, middle school, or high school. And we're going to, again, wed these together in a few moments in terms of their application. But I want you to hear that. They're almost twice as likely to not be in church as adults if they did not like the preacher when they were growing up. Here's the final thing in the research we found in this regard, or these subjects. The more pastors one had growing up, the more likely they were to have strayed. Now, what does that mean? Again, no pastor stays somewhere forever. And having one pastor, as I did, from the time I started church all the way through college, one pastor, never realized the influence that had on me. By the way, as a pastor that I personally loved and respected and felt that that was reciprocated. So I liked my pastor growing up. But here we see that if somebody has 3 or 4 or 5 pastors while growing up, they're more likely to be out of church than someone who just has 1 or 2 pastors, especially if they just had one pastor and they really liked him, they really connected with him. So we need to think through these issues regarding student ministry experience in high school and middle school, and also this relationship with the pastor. And again, they do kind of bleed over with one another, and see how you can enhance the experience of your child. Again, this thought of we're building a network to surround our child. Remember what we said, to say what you would say if they would listen to you. You are saying it, but you know how it goes. You say things and your child ignores you, or you say something over and over and they come back, 2 months later and say, guess what my Bible study leader said? And it's what you've been saying all along. How do we build that network? Well, let's see what this means for parents. I want to kind of go in reverse order of the things I shared in terms of the research and start with the pastor. Always remember that your child views your pastor as God's representative. And that relationship is influencing their spiritual development. Now, we need to break that down for a moment. I hope you understand the doctrine of the priesthood of the believer. You probably could explain it, but let me take for granted for a moment somebody may be a newer believer. Here's what that means. It means because of what Jesus did on the cross, how he sacrificially laid his life down, and how it was affirmed by his resurrection that he was indeed the Son of God. Because of what Jesus did on the cross, you and I have direct access to God. You need not go through a priest or a pastor or a denominational leader or a Bible study leader. I mean, wherever you are right now, any place you are, you can pray and you can go directly to God because of what Jesus did. That's the priesthood of the believer. It's like you're a priest yourself. We think of a priest as being the intermediary between God and man, and indeed, a pastor or a priest has that function. But because of your faith in Christ, you can go directly to God. Well, let's think though for a moment like an 8-year-old. They don't understand concepts like that. Who is the pastor to your child? Who is the pastor to an 8-year-old? I'll tell you who he is. He's God's representative. Man, I've seen this in action in my role as a pastor. I've seen children that I begin to interact with begin to embrace me. And I don't mean that literally, I mean it figuratively. And they're not doing that because my name is Steve Parr, although I would appreciate that. They're literally embracing me. I remember one story, as a matter of fact, I was in a steak and shake in a church in a community where I'd served as interim pastor. And this steak and shake, I walk in and this 4-year-old girl makes a beeline across the room and comes and just grabs me and embraces me. And I don't even know her name. She goes to the church where I'm pastoring, and she's not coming to hug Steve Parr. She's coming to who she's begun to understand as God's representative in her own mind. And here's what you've got to understand. When your child struggles in embracing and loving God's representative tangibly, i.e. your pastor, it makes it more of a challenge for them to embrace God. Wow, if you're a pastor, that's a pretty heavy burden, quite frankly. Well, let's go back to that text. Might that be why when Jesus was in the marketplace there and the children began to gather around, what did the apostles do? They started to shoo the children away. It's like, hey, leave Dr. Jesus alone. He doesn't have time for you boys and girls. But Jesus said, and I'm paraphrasing this, hey, don't dare stop them. Bring those boys and girls on up here. We begin to see that important of, again, God's representation. And for pastors, it's so important that we understand that we embrace that. And we cannot have a CEO mentality where we're just in the pulpit and we're in our offices. Now, this study is not for pastors specifically, and I do have audiences of pastors, and I really dig in on this subject for them. But since primarily we're talking here to church leaders and parents, I want to think about it more from your perspective, and it would be this. Here's the next application. You would do well to be proactive, that means intentional, proactive in connecting your child personally to your pastor. Supporting your pastor as much as possible and addressing critiques with your pastor personally rather than in front of your children. Now, I need to break that down because that was a mouthful right there, I understand. But there were several things about your relationship with your pastor and the way that it affects your children. Notice the first word I said was proactive. I don't know the relationship right now between your pastor and your children. Don't wait on the pastor. You begin, again, to maneuver godly people into your child's life. That means I'd be getting my children into the presence of the pastor, having him in my home. After the worship service, taking him as in your child or your little girl to talk with the pastor. Just that 1 or 2 minutes at a time appears to make a big difference as they begin to build this bond with God's representative, with God's pastor. Remember what the research showed? Those who grew up saying, I liked my pastor growing up, were more likely to be in church as adults. So if that's the case, as a parent, I want to challenge you to be proactive about it. Notice the second thing there, I said to support your pastor. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you straight up. Your pastor will make mistakes. He'll mess up. He'll say wrong things and do wrong things. Now, I know there are egregious errors for which they must be dealt with, and it is appropriate, but I want you to hear this. Support your pastor all you can because you want him to stay for a long time because it enhances the faith of your child. Therefore, be cautious in your critiques. Now listen to this. Criticism is for the point of tearing down. A critique is for the point of building up. And I want to challenge you to critique your pastor. And what that means is whenever you have an issue, the point in addressing it is to build up, not to tear down. Now, the Bible tells you how to deal with any problem you have with your pastor. In Matthew chapter 18, if you disagree with him or he hurt your feelings or said something you didn't like, you see what we tend to do is go home and chew him up for lunch. And what you got to remember is your children are listening, and that is affecting their view of the pastor. So you need to address your pastor specifically because when you address him, he may apologize or he may give an explanation and you may realize you misunderstood and you have no reason to be upset with him. Or it may be just a matter of having a conversation, and trust me, you're going to feel better most times after the conversation. So be careful about the critiques, and I'm not saying ignore it. I'm saying do it in the appropriate way. And also bear in mind that you want a pastor that's healthier for your child if they have a longer tenure. So support him. Watch those critiques and be careful, especially about how you address your pastor in front of your children. You see, because here's what you've got to understand. What your child begins to believe and think and feel towards your pastor now is how they will think and believe and feel about pastors when they're an adult. Because that's their whole framework when they're a child. And you know, when you were 14, it seemed like a year took 5 years. You remember when you were 11, a year took forever? Well, we now know at the age you're at now, a year goes by like that. But when you're a child, it takes so long. It seems so long. What's happening is it's over time, there's an impression being made on your child by your pastor. So what you want to do is have a good relationship with that pastor. You want to connect your child to him. And you want that relationship to be strong so they've got a good view not only of their pastor, but they've got a good taste in their mouth about what pastors should be doing and what pastors are like. So take some initiative there. Now, let's shift a little bit into the student pastor. There's some similar issues that we found. But in terms of your application here, a vocational student leader is advantageous. Man, if your church can afford it, that is awesome. By the way, I spent 10 years of my ministry as a vocational student pastor. I began my ministry bivocationally. I was a teacher and a coach in a local school, and I served my church beginning as a volunteer. And then God called me to ministry, and I served in a church part-time, full-time at the school, part-time in the church, and that is advantageous when you can do that. But here's the key. It's not a necessity for your child's spiritual development, and that is good news, and I want to tell you why. In my state where I serve, there are 3,600 churches that belong to the denomination where I serve. Now, out of 3,600, take a quick guess in your own mind. How many of them have a vocational student pastor on staff? The answer is 400. 400 out of 3,600. That means 3,200 do not have a vocational student pastor. Here's the good news. If it was required that your church had a vocational student pastor for your child to flourish in their spiritual growth, in our case, 3,200 of our churches and their children will be in trouble. You know what the good news is? You can do a great job with student ministry with volunteer leaders. And if you're in a smaller church like that, or even a mid-sized church that does not have a vocational student pastor, volunteers can do a great job. And right here, as I sit in this place, I am the product of a volunteer student pastor, a young man who had tremendous influence on my life. As a matter of fact, I never had a vocational youth pastor when I was growing up. So to youth pastors, man, I love you. I thank you for what you do. And I did that for many years. And if you're serving, take advantage of that. If you're a church and can afford it, take advantage of that. But remember, it's not critical. It's advantageous, but not critical. It's not a necessity. But remember this, where there is a vocational student pastor, likability and sustainability are important features. It's just like with your pastor. If you have a vocational student pastor, and your teenager does not like him or her, they're less likely to be in church when they're adults. So for student pastors, there's a lot of important qualities they should have, including how to handle the Word of God, how to attend to the safety and security of children when they're doing activities, how to minister to parents, how to raise up volunteers. But it's also important that they have good people skills, that they relate well to teenagers that are likable, but just as well the teenagers sometimes that aren't likable, and we all have experienced those. I'm sure that you have. I know that I have. So that's important. The next thing, adult leaders are critical, whether vocational or volunteer. There's the key. There does need to be adults in the life of your teenager, whether they're on staff, whether they're paid, or whether they're volunteer. Why? And I've stated it, but to make it clear, they give the words of the parents credibility and reinforcement during the struggles of adolescence. And don't you remember from your experience, it is a struggle to be a teenager. It's a struggle to be a teenager today. these other leaders. You're building this network. That's why it's so important. I can't believe some parents don't go to church. They don't take their children to church. And then they wonder why their children aren't committed spiritually, why they don't love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. You've got to surround your children with adults who love God. And it makes a huge difference whether they're on staff or whether they're volunteers. Now, I want you to hear this. A vibrant student ministry experience, just like you'll learn with some other areas, is not built on resources, but rather on adult leadership and consistency. So if you're in a smaller congregation and do not have a lot of resources, the resources are not the key. It would be the people. They are the key. It may be you. We did learn through research, and this is an application, intensive experience like camps, Christian camps now, seem to fuel faith development. Here's why. And I've led a lot of student camps and seen a lot of big things happen in students' lives. It goes like this. While a child is at a camp for a whole week, or maybe a Disciple Now weekend, or some experience like that, whether it's a weekend experience or a week-long experience, progress is made in seasons where you feed the spirit and starve the flesh. Think about it for a second. You know, we take students to the camps, and they would be there, and we'd be away from the television, away from the negative peer influences, away from the electronics and the media, and they starve their flesh, and there's Bible study going on. We're feeding the Spirit. More Bible study in a week than they got in maybe 2 or 3 months. And I've seen this happen. Teenagers who are somewhat hardened will come to the retreat, and on Monday they're still hardened. On Tuesday they begin to relax a little bit, and then on Wednesday, after 3 days of fun but also some intense Bible study, God in their hearts begins to break down some barriers, begins to again to till the soil of their heart, and they become more receptive. And I've seen students come to faith in Christ. I've seen students called to ministry. I've seen students make those life-changing decisions at these camps. And we not only found that, again, going to camp matters, but the more the better. So I want my children in good, credible, safe, fun, biblically based Christian camps and retreats and weekends. They make a difference. Kind of like the old days, you know, when we'd have revival services Sunday through Wednesday or Friday. We don't do that as much in church today, and I'm not even commenting on we should or we should not. I'm just pointing out what would happen. You'd enjoy it on Sunday, on Monday, on Tuesday, by Wednesday, man. God was just filling your spirit. Why? Because you're not going home and watching television. You're not going home doing the things the evening usually do. You're sacrificing time, and you're feeding your spirit, and you're starving your flesh. That's exactly what happens at these retreats. Now, here's the summary of it all. If a person growing up attended a church with a good children's ministry, we learned that last week, a strong student ministry, and had a close relationship with multiple adult volunteers, had minimal turnover in leadership. You see, with the pastor, student pastor, and even adult volunteers, not just coming and going every few months, but if you're an adult volunteer, staying with it 2 or 3 or 4 years, staying a long time. They like their leaders, and they attended Christian camps and retreats as a teen, he or she is much more likely to be in church as an adult. So you begin to see that's kind of like a potpourri or a stew of different things that begin to come together to strengthen your child's faith. That is what I mean by building a network. Now imagine for a moment, it's not just mom and not just dad, not just mom and dad, but we've got the pastor in this relationship, and we've got Bible study leaders and adult volunteers and a student pastor, and we're going to these once or twice a year retreats where it's very intensive, and we're fueling their passion, we're pouring into the teenager. And you see, you begin to blend all these things together, and those are the teenagers who are more likely to stay or to still be in church when they're adults. And so you need to wrestle with that as a parent and a church leader. Now remember this, somebody has to lead the way. This is not just about your teens, but the teens in your church. Have you given some time to children's ministry, to student ministry? I want to challenge you to volunteer to work with students or with children, because there are other parents who need you, just like you as a parent need those other volunteers, building that network of influence for your child's spiritual development. I want you to take time now, if you're in a small group, to talk about these issues and to think about how to apply and what you need to do moving forward, or perhaps with your spouse, or if you're not in a group with another adult that you have a lot of respect for. And think about how you might use this to help your child in their faith in building this network of relationships. And I think if and when you do, you see it will not only make a difference now, but will make a difference for all of their lives.